Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 151. Today's guest is Amorak Huey. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. For today's episode, I am pleased to bring you a KTCO Book Club conversation with poet Amorak Huey, in which we discuss Layli Long Soldier's 2017 poetry collection, Whereas. Amorak Huey is the author of 4 books of poems, including Dad Jokes from Late in the Patriarchy, published by Sundress in 2021. Co-founder with Han Vanderhart of River Books, Huey teaches at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. He also is co-author with W. Todd Kaneko of the textbook Poetry, A Writer's Guide and Anthology, published by Bloomsbury in 2024. So I had first heard of Layli Long Soldier's Whereas when she was the guest on David Naiman's show Between the Covers back in 2018. And by the way, if you haven't heard that interview, I do highly recommend it. I bought and read the book the following year, and I found it both formally interesting and really just moving. The title poem, which takes up the second half of the book, is a long poem that mirrors and takes language from the 2009 Congressional Resolution of Apology to the Native Americans, and it both sort of skewers the emptiness of what is really a non-apology and turns that language into something meaningful and embodied and resonant. As you'll hear Amorak and I talk about, the whole book is about language, but it's about language in a way that has real stakes and depth and meaning, I think. It's just an amazing book, and I was so happy to revisit it for this conversation. I've put links in the show notes that you can use to purchase your own copy of Whereas. There are links to Gathering Volumes in Parisburg, Ohio, to the Book Catapult here in San Diego, and to bookshop.org. As always, though, if there is an independent bookstore in your community, I highly recommend buying from there instead. You can also find links in the show notes to Amorak's website, as well as a purchase link for his latest book of poems. And finally, as I released this episode, it was just my birthday a few days ago, and if you wanted to do a nice thing for me and for the show, why not leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser? It's free, it just takes a minute, and it not only helps support the show, but also puts just the tiniest of smiles on my normally expressionless face. In fact, you know what? As long as I'm asking for favors on my birthday, go leave a review for someone else's podcast as well. Podcasting is such a strange endeavor, and a little listener feedback goes a long way. Okay, enough of that. On with the show. Here's my conversation with Amorak Huey about Layli Long Soldier's Whereas. So I was really interested that this was the book that you picked, Layli Long Soldier's Whereas. And this is something I often ask people in these little book club episodes, is what was it about this book that made you want to talk about it with me?
I love this book. I think it's probably my favorite book of poetry, and I've read it many, many times, and it does so much of what I want poems to do. It's all in here, and there's so many different kinds of poems in here. And it's a little difficult, but not all of it's difficult. It feels important to me. I guess I hesitate to declare something as important because it feels like I'm then giving myself the right to decide what's important. But this book feels important to me. Mm-hmm. And I also think it's beautiful and moving.
It's an interesting thing, this idea of saying that something's important. And I do think that it's worth pointing out that, this is a collection of poems that is written by a Lakota woman, and neither of us is Lakota or a woman. I'm not sure how you identify your ethnicity. I'm Japanese American man. And there is I think in some ways a little bit of a discomfort for me anyway, not to discuss or to read, but to feel like I'm expressing any kind of authority when talking about the art of a person who belongs to a community that I'm not a part of. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I think you have to be careful in how you, like I said, this book's not important because I say it's important. It's important to me, and I get to say that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I I agree
but
with you.
Certainly you're not the only person to say that this is an important book.
No, right. I mean, it was a National Book Award finalist, and it's obviously extremely well read and well thought of. So, but I think you're right that you have to be careful in how you talk about these books, but I don't think that we're not allowed to, or even that we shouldn't. I think we should. We just have to understand the limits of our perceptions of them, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I think this is an interesting thing, books, art in general, but I think in particular, literature has this ability to open us up to different perspectives in ways that, because just the nature of human existence is that we don't get to directly see or experience someone else's life or thoughts or feelings. And so having this kind of technology, I suppose you could say, that allows us to have some visibility into someone else's experience of life, I think is really important. And to say that that would be off limits unless you are that person would kind of mean that we're only allowed to read our own things, right?
Right, which would be terrible. I mean, Mark Doty says that we go to poetry to see someone else's mind at work on the world. That's the gift of the kind of intensity that this book offers, is we get to see the poet's mind at work on the world through language specifically. It's not just at work on the world, but like trying to find language for an individual consciousness in the world, in the human experience.
Yeah. So you used a word a little bit ago. You said that there are poems in here. Not all of them are difficult, but some of them are difficult. This is a thing that I've been thinking a lot about as I've been reading poetry, especially this year. The poems that I've been reading this year, both for the show and just in general in my life, I am a poetry reader. To some extent, I'm also a poetry writer, but I find that some poems are just sort of harder for me to enter than others. But that question of a poem being difficult or not is something that, well, one, it feels like it could be a little bit fraught, but also I just think it's sort of an interesting question. Like, what do we mean when we say that the poems are difficult? Do you know what I mean?
I do. And I think this book, the poems in this book offers a couple different ways of thinking of difficulty. Some of them are difficult because the subject matter is painful or, it's unflinching look at atrocity, genocide. And so that's difficult. But also she's using syntax in a way that is not common, right? It's not the syntax of narrative prose necessarily. Mm-hmm. And she's also using the space on the page in a way that is not necessarily it doesn't look like a novel. There's the poem that is a square, and then you have to physically turn the book to read it comfortably.
Yeah.
Poems with a line down the middle. Those are poems that challenge our expectations, I think, of text. And so when I think of these poems as difficult, that's what I think of. Like someone who doesn't spend a lot of time with poetry would come to this and go, why is this doing this? Why does it look like this? Why is this not just text in paragraphs? Mm-hmm. And this book seems to be embracing that in a way that I find slows us down as a reader. This says you're going to have to spend some time reading this. You can't skim through it. And I think that's all poetry, but this book in particular, I think, goes there.
Yeah. Well, I think that thing that you just said, that's all poetry. There is I find it's very difficult to even define what poetry is in any kind of, authoritative, declarative kind of way. But I think that we have some sense that poetry involves heightened language in some way. It's interesting talking to you. You are also a poet yourself, and I've read a number of your poems, and I've always found your poems to be, and I'm not sure if this is primarily because of the language or primarily because of the subject matter that you write about, or that you often write about, I should say, that I've always found your poems to be fairly accessible, to me at least. Mm-hmm. And I find it interesting to sort of, I think the poems that Layli Long Soldier wrote in this collection are pretty different in a lot of ways from the kind of poems that you write. And I'm sort of skating around a question here. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but you know, like I find it interesting to, you know, talk to someone who works in ostensibly the same medium, but in a really different way. You know what I mean?
I do. And yeah, I don't think my poems are much like hers at all. I think maybe lately in my collection that is sort of in progress, I'm doing more things with syntax than I used to do. I mean, I don't know. I don't have a great answer for why I'm drawn to poems that are different than mine. Maybe that's why I'm drawn to them. I'm like trying to push against the limits of my aesthetic. But as a reader, I'm really drawn to experimentation with syntax. I'm drawn to poems that challenge me. My own poems, I think I'm moving slowly in that direction. But for a long time, I think the biggest influence on my sort of poetic style syntax was my years as a newspaper journalist and copy editor, where clarity and sort of standard correctness were of the utmost importance. And I think I had to, it takes a long time to sort of shake those habits, I guess. And I like finding poems. I mean, another poet that I think has been really influential to me that I don't think anyone would see their work in mine is Jory Graham. And again, I'm drawn to her use of syntax and the way she spins out sentences and interrupts them in strange places, which I don't think I do. But as a reader, there's something in there that gives me permission to look at language differently.
I think that there is always something sort of attractive about seeing art where you know enough about the form to sort of be able to see what someone else is doing, but that they're doing it in a way that you wouldn't or couldn't. There's always something fascinating about that. These poems in particular, I mean, to some degree, I think it might be fair to say that all poems are in one way or another about language, but I feel like these poems in particular are very, very much about language. And something that for me that I was thinking about as I was reading these poems, I read it, I think twice more to prep for this, but I'd read it once or twice before that as well, a long time ago when the book was newer. There are poets out there whose work is very much about language. And oftentimes I am kind of put off by that, because while I may find the individual poems to be perhaps clever or intelligent or, you know, maybe even interesting in sort of a philosophical kind of way, a lot of times I feel like the stakes are very low. Like if we're just talking about language as a phenomenon, that it's not tied to anything that feels urgent to me. You know, it can be very heady, you know, whereas
nice.
with these poems, she is very much foregrounding language in a number of ways. Like, you know, for example, in the way that she does unexpected things with syntax and with punctuation, with the arrangement of words on the page, all of these things. I do not come away with the sense that this is just sort of playing around with words. You know, it really does feel that there is an urgency and an emotional heft to this that I often don't find, at least me personally, my personal experience with poetry that's sort of more language centric. I don't know what you think about that, though.
I mean, I know exactly what you mean. I think I'm drawn in general to poems that are about language sort of explicitly, but often I think you're right that there can be just sort of it's a cleverness to the poem that is cleverness for its own sake. But I think, part of what she's writing about here is the dangers of colonization, right? And the colonization specifically of language. And the second half of the book, which is the whereas statements, and it's a response to the congressional apology to the native peoples. I feel like that does such important work contrasting. And I don't know if you've read the actual apology. I mean, much of it appears, much of it appears in excerpt in the poems, but I've read the whole apology too. And it's so careful and it's so abstract and it so deftly avoids anything difficult or challenging or personal. There's no sense that a human being was at the other end of these words. that's the damage that language can do when it's not poetry, I guess, or when it's not personal, when it's not about human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And she takes that language and contrasts it with her own whereas statements which are embodied. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm drawn to in this book is how embodied the language is, how the poems come from a place in the human body and are sort of, so as much as they're about language and the body. And so there's not that emptiness of, oh, this is a clever statement about lyricism, or this is not a pipe kind of language. It's language as an attempt to bring the human body to the page. I think about the line where she talks about going to the dentist on the reservation and they don't have the tools or the supplies or the money to do anything but pull her tooth out by the root. But the poem is also about reparations, and she talks about how the root of reparations is repair. I feel like that's a moment where the body and the human body and language come together with sort of devastating effect.
Yeah. To me, a lot of what she's doing in foregrounding language is showing the difference in the way different people and different kinds of people utilize language. And so in some ways, it's not just about what language is, it's about what language does, but specifically that language, at least in the way that she's utilizing it, is much more centered on it being an interpersonal thing, like something from a person to a person. Mm-hmm. That particular poem that you mentioned is an interesting one. And I do feel like in some ways it bears on the beginning of the conversation that we had, because of the fact that you have this figure, this other character besides herself and the dentist, of this young white girl who has left a comment on a newspaper article. And this young girl is encouraging other people to sign a petition, I believe, to support reparations and get an apology from the government. And it's interesting here because I feel like this is it's such a direct comment on the ways in which people can be well-meaning but still ignorant, you know?
For sure.
I thought that was a very interesting moment, especially to a reader like me who, although I'm not a white person, you know, I'm also not a native person. So I feel like there is a way in which I'm not really sure. I mean, because I don't want to speculate on who she was imagining was going to be reading these poems. But for me, at least, there is a way in which I can feel sort of drawn in, but also there's a way that it says like, but look at what you're doing here. Make sure you're aware of what you're doing here. Do you know what I mean?
I do. And I think there's anger at places that is present in this book, but there's not in that particular poem. The speaker is so tender to the figure of that girl who's well-meaning but clumsy and unaware. I think that poem could be sharper toward that person. And it's interesting to me that it's not.
Yeah.
The rebuke feels...
It feels more like a lesson than like a rebuke, really, in some ways.
Right. Yeah, there's a gentleness, but there's also like a resignation on the part of the speaker who's like, this has already happened. There's nothing is going to change. Your wishes aren't actually going to change anything. Mm-hmm. And so it's both a lesson, like you're saying, but also like a sadness. Like it wouldn't do any good for me to critique you more harshly because that wouldn't change anything either.
Yeah. So you mentioned, of course, the second section of this is the title of the second section is the title of the book, Whereas, and that's the response to this congressional resolution of apology to Native Americans. And that is the part that really stuck in my mind. So when I came back to it in preparation to talk to you about this book, I remembered that was only part of the book. I remembered that was only the second section, the second half of the book, let's say. Mm-hmm. But for whatever reason, the first part it didn't stay in my head as much, which coming back to it now is both surprising and not surprising. Not surprising insofar as the second section does share the title with the book as a whole. And I think that because of its length and because of what it's doing in interfacing with this government language is is the kind of thing that will stick in your mind, especially if you're sort of politically minded, as I am.
Mm-hmm.
But you have this whole first section of the collection, which is a lot more varied, and some of the same themes are happening in that first section, but it's just interesting to me that these are being paired together. And we start with, well, actually, the very first thing we start with is an epigraph from Arthur Z, I think, which I had to look up is apparently not from something he wrote, but something that he said in a class that she took, which that's interesting. But then the first thing that we get in part 1 is a little tercet that's not part of any other named poem. Now make room in the mouth for grasses, grasses, grasses. And this is interesting to me too, because that compound word grasses, grasses, grasses with no spaces in between is also how the collection ends. Mm-hmm. What do you make of this first little nugget that's just, it's by itself, it's not quite in the middle of the page, but it's got a lot of space around it, and it's off on its own, not part of any other named poem. What do you make of this?
I mean, I think that it's almost, when you first come to it, it invites you to sort of read it quickly and move on because it doesn't have the trappings of a poem. It's not very long. It seems relatively straightforward, except for the, making grasses, grasses, grasses a single word. But I feel like it has power when you come back to it later. And I think that this is partly a book about place, right? It's about the plains, and the grass becomes an important symbol throughout the book. And I think the grasses are connected to the bodies of the people who live on the grasses, the people who inhabit the plains. And of course, now is a reminder that this, I think, to start with the word now on a line by itself feels to me like a reminder that this isn't a book about history, even though much of it is about history. The book is about the people who are alive now. And there's a presentness to these concerns, where a book about, white people's European genocide against the Native Americans might feel like a book about history. This is a reminder that it's not just history. And then, of course, the make room in the mouth feels to me like it's connected to the book's concern with language, thinking about what sustains us. Of course, make room in the mouth would be about eating and nourishment, but also about speaking and language and giving expression to the self. I don't have a great, quick paraphrase of what this means to me, but I feel like it evokes a lot of the things that come up later. The grasses, grasses, grasses comes up over and over again, including in the poem 38, which is probably the most, besides the whereas statements, the most well-known poem from the book. And so I feel like it does a good job for me of setting up things that I'm going to need to pay attention to throughout this book. Language, the present tenseness of it, the urgency of it being a now, and then thinking about the land, the landscape, the place. Yeah.
It also situates, to the extent that, we're making room in the mouth, it puts language in your mouth so this is like a connection between language and the body, just like you were saying before. There's also, for me, this compounding of grasses, 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 especially in the context of the book as a physical object. The cover image is of a native person sort of hunkered down in tall grass, looking sort of away from the camera. And at different points throughout the book, particularly for me in the poem Steady Summer, there's not just a focus on language, but on sounds that are sort of nonverbal or pre-verbal, perhaps, where in that poem we get the grasses saying shh to you, and which is also the sound that tall grass makes in wind. And so this grasses, grasses, grasses at the very beginning, to me, is also evoking that same sort of sense of a sound that can be meaningful without being words, perhaps. It's interesting how much can be encapsulated in 3 lines in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 words.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then right after this, we get a poem that's called He Sapa, which I'm probably not pronouncing correctly because I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce all the diacritics and everything in the, Lakota orthography.
Mm-hmm.
And so throughout this first section, there are a number of poems that start with native words that are sort of talking about in some ways, the definitions of these words.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting to me, so this first poem here is starting with what sounds like a correction, right? Like He is a mountain as He is a horn that comes from a shift in the river, throat to mouth, followed by Sapa, a kind of black sleek in the rise of both. Remember, He Sapa is not a black hill, not Paha Sapa by any name you call it. It's not that. It's not this thing that you maybe thought it was. What's interesting to me about this is, so this collection is written in English, right? And so in that way, like, there's probably going to be a lot of people who read this who don't know this other language. And at the beginning here, there's almost, to me, a sense of, the first time through it, a sense that I'm almost being chided in some way, except that as the poems continue, you come to the realization that she herself is also not a fluent speaker of this language, which complicates it in a number of different ways. You know what I mean?
I do. There's the one poem where she talks about becoming a mother and feeling this obligation to pass on language and traditions that she herself doesn't know. And someone says, it's okay, you'll learn together. And that sort of feels like what's happening throughout some of these poems is the chiding is directed at us, but also at the self as we learn together.
Yeah. One of the things that I was thinking about, there's a poem that's called, again, and I'm going to pronounce it, I'm sure not correctly. It's something like Tulkahan. I was actually reading this again right before bed last night. And it starts off with this definition: to lose, to suffer loss, to be gone, lost. And in this poem, she starts off with a discussion of what this word means, and then transitions to this incident, perhaps. I'm not sure what the right word to use is, where she's sent by a friend, or perhaps just someone she knows, an old friend, maybe one that she hasn't seen in a long time, who has sent her, like texted her a picture of his face after he's been beaten. And then that brings us to, she's looking for a different word that would be able to describe the proper way to respond to something like that. But she can't find that word in this dictionary that she has. So she has nothing but to come back to this word of loss, of being lost. It was such for one thing, it's such an upsetting image to be faced with, the literal image that's being described in this poem. More than that, one thing that, I was thinking a lot about this idea of language loss. For a person like me, so I'm, like I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, but I'm 5th generation Japanese American. So my family has been here a very long time, and neither I nor my parents nor some of my grandparents can speak our ancestral language. And I've made some attempts as an adult to gain a little bit, take classes, lessons, things like that. I have a little bit more facility with it than I did when I was a teenager, but not much. And there is something about this disconnection from this language that is supposed to be your language that feels in common with me. But the thing that I'm very mindful of as I'm thinking about it is that there's a really big difference between losing a language because of the choices that your family made to assimilate on their own, and, whether or not people had, immigrants have good choices or things like that is a question that could be asked, but it's nevertheless on some level a voluntary process, as opposed to a process where this language was taken away from your ancestors purposely to try and force a cultural change and assimilation on a people, which is itself a form of genocide. That is a very different thing. So I don't know, this is just something, this idea of language, of not knowing the language, of this sort of perhaps shame that comes with not being able to speak this language that's supposed to be yours. And she even has a line in one of these poems about a language that she dares to call hers or something like that. that it's so present throughout these poems, and for me personally, with my own family history also being, again, both a point of entry and connection, but also something that really highlights a strong difference between my family's experience and what she's talking about. I don't know. I found that really, really powerful.
Yeah, I agree that there's such a depth of feeling in these poems. Nothing feels facile or tossed off. She's willing to take these sort of questions that may begin as surface level or definitional questions and then follow them all the way to their roots in trauma, genocide, the experience that real people have had, people that she feels connection to, that she experiences that she herself has had and continues to have. I wonder if this question is why these two parts of the book are in the same book. So we have the first part, which is concerned with sort of she, the speaker, is figuring out how much of this language she can get back, how much of it she feels entitled to use, perhaps. And then the second part of the book, the whereas statements, is why these questions exist in the first place. Like you said, this language isn't accidentally lost. It was, ripped away on purpose, like you're saying. And so the whereas section becomes necessary structural context for why the poems in the first half of the book exist in the first place.
It's an interesting thing to think about these two parts being put together. I feel like you're right that there's this historical context, and especially because this resolution was only from 2009. So again, it is in the past now, but it's not ancient history, right?
Right.
As opposed to like in 38, where she's describing something that happens in 1862, the execution of the Dakota 38, which in some ways sounds like a long time ago, but when you stop and think about it, it wasn't actually that long ago in terms of number of human lives ago. 1862 is maybe 6 generations ago. It's not a lot.
Right.
But I think another thing that's happening in marrying these two parts here is that, yes, the sort of historical and legal parts of it provide a context for the current moment, right? But also that the current moment part is providing a context for, what does it look like to be living in the aftermath of genocide? There are things that are described in the first section, which you could, on one level, say has nothing to do with genocide. Like, one of them is a birth story. One of them is a miscarriage story. These are, the story about the miscarriage is in many ways very similar to other poems that I've read about miscarriages that were written by women who are not Native, right? Or, there are descriptions of relationships with parents, of a father who was an alcoholic but sort of cleaned himself up, and he's apologizing for the ways in which he failed as a father in the past. And again, these are things that you could imagine a similar story, or perhaps you've even read similar poems, like poems about similar subjects, who are written by a person coming out of a very different context. And yet, I think it would also be false to say that the fact of brutality, of genocide, of forced assimilation, that these things have nothing to do with it, with these personal stories, is also incorrect. That these are depicting these stories in a way that you can't separate the personal from the big historical moments. That in some way, all of this is a part of the same story. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right, that we exist within these large institutional and cultural structures and within this historical context, and we can't escape that. And so our stories that are, I don't know, maybe more common or universal stories about love or birth or death or parent-child relationships, even those stories take place in a particular social, historical context. And to go sort of thinking about how we talk about literature, maybe this connects back to our beginning conversation, part of the conversation where we're talking about how to talk about this book and how to approach a book where you're not the subject, or maybe not the audience either. Like, there was this tendency for a long time, and still in some places, to think of like whiteness in America, to think of like whiteness and European whiteness as a default that doesn't have those contexts. We just are. I am a white guy. I can write about love, and it's just about love. But it never is. It always exists in my particular historical situation, in my racial, economic identities, my religious identity. All of those things are going to be part of how I write about things that are common across, cultures, across, like parenting, birthing, dying, grief, love, loss. All those things are common, but for any individual, they exist within that particular context.
Yeah. I guess I do wonder how many people would be able to make the leap between saying, look at how this is true for a person, for a Lakota woman, to saying this is also true of me, which you just did. But I do sort of wonder, I wonder to what extent that realization is accessible to someone who's coming to this book as a reader. Although, again, the question of who the reader of this book is like, that seems very complicated as well.
Yeah, it does seem, I think audience is always a complicated question. I think if you're willing to spend the time that this book asks you to spend with it, I feel like it would be hard not to begin to make some of those realizations.
One would hope.
I just can't, it's hard for me to imagine reading this book in the way that it asks to be read, which is thoughtfully, slowly, carefully, and with an open heart, I guess. I don't know. But like with just an openness to what it has to say about the experiences of this poet, of these speakers, the people and characters, which I think you get the sense that the poet and the speaker are not especially far apart in this situation.
Right.
I feel like if you come to this book willing to meet it where it is, it helps make those realizations inevitable. I hope. I don't know, maybe I'm being optimistic, but I feel like that's part of the work that poetry should be doing.
I think it is a question of, I guess, whether to what extent a person can overcome their own biased perceptions in order to meet a poem where it's asking to be met. I think that's a tall order. And I think that these poems are doing that. I don't know. I think that just as you said, the fact that these poems require you to slow down and sort of think through them, to breathe through them, to come to them in from more than one angle, I suppose. That if you're able to do that, for sure. But I don't know. It's always a sort of an interesting question, because there are no work of art is going to be able to reach everybody, and that's just true, right? And I don't even think it's the job of the poem or the poet to try to do that. But the idea that I'm going to set this up in such a way that if you're able to meet it where it's asking to be met, then you will have this experience. That is, in some ways, perhaps the best you can hope for with a work of art. I don't know. Yeah,
poetry doesn't scale, right? Right. It's not going to create mass conversions towards enlightenment. But if it connects with a person at a time, I think that probably is all you can ask.
Yeah. Well, and I think that these poems have, like you were saying before, a certain skepticism to them about what can be done,
Mm-hmm.
There is that sort of sense of resignation in some, maybe not all of them, but at least in some of them. There's a way in which there's a humor to, especially in the last whereas section of the book, and how it mirrors the resolution itself, the congressional resolution, but it ends in a way that I find kind of really funny. Like just the little disclaimer at the end, which is again mirroring the disclaimer at the end of the resolution, which says nothing in this resolution either supports or settles any claims against the United States. So we're apologizing to you, but this is purely symbolic. You're not allowed to do anything with this, right? Which is the kind of thing that's outrageous. Just on its face, right? You have to ask the question of what is the point of apologizing in the first place if you're not going to take any responsibility for anything that's happened and not try to offer any repair, right? But I mean, which is something that she explicitly goes into, like that in between the whereas and the semicolon of these resolutions is nothing is actionable, right?
Right.
But just that on some level, maybe the writing of this book or the reading of this book, like there's a lot of limits to what it can accomplish, but just being able to make fun of this language in this way, is
right.
something.
It is something. The end does feel like a joke. I mean, like the mirroring is like how ridiculous that a book of poetry could serve to settle a claim of an individual poet against a nation. But it's funny. But then it ends with here in the grasses again, a reminder that the United States might be this sort of large abstraction with no human being at its core, but there's a real person, maybe like the one on the cover of the book, sitting in these grasses.
Yeah.
In the aftermath of genocide, like you said earlier.
Yeah. It's also interesting to me that in this last line, to serves as a settlement of any claim against Layli Long Soldier by the United States, comma, herein, and then a long space before the grasses, period. That space right there, that separation between the beginning of this clause and the grasses, the way that she uses these sort of little, I'm not sure what you call them, like if it's like a visual caesura or something like that, right? But like she uses these at different points, right? Ways of breaking up the text, and here this separation between herein and the grasses feels very meaningful,
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking just in general about when I encounter those in poetry, I often feel like the poet is giving you space to fill in. I mean, it's like in real time, it's a nanosecond, less than a nanosecond as your eyes move across the page. But there is a real time pause before you get to the next words. And I think our brains are quick enough to begin to guess what those next words are going to be, to begin to fill in that blank ourselves before we get to the real answer. And it mirrors a little bit the poem earlier where she just takes some of the language from the apology and redacts words. And then if you turn the page, the redacted words are there. And so I think she's constantly playing with that. What do you expect to be in these white spaces? And here's what might be in these white spaces. Here's what actually is in these white spaces in the case of the apology. But then those redacted words without the apology around it are so much more powerful than where they would have appeared in the middle of this sort of empty rhetoric.
Yeah. I feel like there is a lot in these poems that, I mean, we've mentioned that she's doing things with syntax that are challenging, that sort of break up language in ways that are unexpected. There's also, I think, and I know that this is something that happens not just in her poems, and many poets do this, but there are ways in which there are elements of meaning that cannot be spoken out loud about this. Like, how would you read a poem where there are these white spaces in the middle of the poems? Or, how do you convey that with your voice? Or in other ways, for example, sometimes she'll put slashes in, which that feels different to me as well. Like sometimes the slashes feel like a cutting, but sometimes it feels like a joining together. There are also times when she does sort of strange things with punctuation, where like in one of the poems, she reads, instead of putting commas in, she puts the word comma. But then sometimes there actually is a comma, and it'll happen in a place where you wouldn't normally put a comma. And then sometimes there are ways in which there would normally be commas there, but there are no commas, and things just all kind of run together. But how would you say that out loud? You can only see it with your eyes if it's written down. And that's, I don't know, fascinating to me, to say the least.
For sure. I mean, I think there's something about, these are poems. Could you read them out loud? Yes, but you would lose something, right? You'd have to make a choice. Mm-hmm. I'm going to give an overlong pause, which feels like a kind of artifice that the poem's not actually doing. Or I'm just going to read through it, and then you're missing that. So I feel like there's something about experiencing these poems on the page that is unique to the page. And what you were just talking about with the comma poem and the other things she does with punctuation. At the beginning of 38, I mean, the poem begins by sort of telling us about how it's going to approach grammar and punctuation. And it begins with, here the sentence will be respected. And of course, sentence in that poem goes on to mean the sentence of execution against the Dakota 38, passed by Lincoln. And so, which of course, the poem doesn't respect that sentence. There's almost a sarcasm to hear the sentence will be respected. And that poem, of course, is the most straightforward syntax of any poem in the book. Probably it's just a series of sentences like we would expect from prose. So everything that she does feels deliberate to me and asks me to sort of sit and think, why, what is the effect of not why is the wrong question, because I can't answer. I will never know why she did these things, but what is the effect on me of doing these things? And I think it asks me to question my own assumptions about language. And I think, yeah.
Yeah. That poem, you said it is a series of sentences up until the very end, right?
Right.
Because at the very end, there's a point midway down the last page of the poem where syntactically it is still a grammatical sentence. When Myrick's body was found, comma, his mouth was stuffed with grass, period. But there's like a line break and a space in between the two clauses of that sentence. And then the very last couple of lines, there are periods that happen at points where periods aren't supposed to be in a normal grammatical sentence.
Right.
Which, of course, it does feel extremely purposeful.
And in both of those cases, grass is part of the image of that moment in the poem. And I think maybe the poem is saying something about things that there aren't language for. The grass doesn't need language syntax to be grass, right? And so it's reaching for, those are moments where the poem begins to reach past language. I mean, I feel like that's what poems are doing anyhow. We're trying to run up against the edges of what language can do. I mean, a love poem is not being in love, but how close can you get? Right? Yeah.
This particular poem, it is a challenging poem to read in terms of its subject matter, and in particular this idea of a people who are being exiled and starved by an adversary that is hopelessly more powerful. And what does it mean for this? She uses the same word to describe what Abraham Lincoln does to the Dakota 38 as she does to describe what the Dakota do to this traitor, Andrew Myrick. She uses the word execute in both of these cases. And then, because this is the last poem in the first section, the next section with the whereas poem, we get one of the whereas statements in the original resolution, which she writes about in her poem, is to do with whereas, I'm paraphrasing here, but whereas both sides did bad things to each other.
Right.
Having that context for this place where the text finally does break, it is a potent moment in this poem for sure. It's something that is, I would just, I guess, say that, as much as this book and that poem did strike me when I read it for the first time, however many years ago it was. When did this come out? Like 2019, I think?
I think the book is
2017, yeah. And then I probably read it a year or two later. It is in 2024 perhaps hitting in a way that is a little different or additional to the way that it hit at the time that I read it the first time. It's a lot. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's part of what's heartbreaking about a book like this continuing to be powerful, continuing to be urgent in the present moment, I guess.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you wanted to talk about with this book?
I mean, I think we've hit on the things that I love about this book. I mean, I guess I just want to reiterate, I love this book. It feels important to me personally, but also in a bigger sense. I've taught this book a lot of times, and I do feel like the students who are willing to spend time in this book are changed by that experience. I mean, I've spent an entire class period talking about the poem 38, so an hour and 15 minutes with undergraduate poetry students, digging into what this poem is doing with language, with subject matter, with history, with a story that many of them who are from the Midwest are not familiar with, and thinking about the work that poetry can do to remind us of our history, the parts of our history that maybe the status quo doesn't want to bring up. And so I feel like this book succeeds I don't know what specifically Layli Long Soldier's ambitions for the book are, but the ambitions that I feel from the book, I feel like it succeeds in them.
Especially at a time right now when the suppression of objectionable, quote unquote, objectionable history
right.
is so much at the forefront of our national politics. The idea that these are portions of American history that already have been suppressed, it does really, unfortunately, remind so much about how these things are not in the past. Yeah, for sure.
Right. I mean, right. It begins with the word now. And there's this, at the beginning of the whereas section, she talks about being someone who must live, who must mother, who must eat. And these concerns are not intellectual concerns about history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the last question that I always ask to close out is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Sure. The one that comes to mind is a novel I just recently finished called Babel by R.F. Kuang. That is, I mean, it's about many of these same things. It's about language. It's about translation. It's about, colonial destruction, what colonization has done with the world. Do you know the book?
I've heard of it a lot. I haven't read it. I actually haven't read anything by R.F. Kuang, but I do have on my shelf a copy of Yellowface that I haven't cracked yet.
Okay.
And I've been meaning to, and then I started hearing, I don't know, in the last couple of months. Is it a fairly new book, this one?
This one is, I think, before Yellowface.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Because I feel like I hadn't heard of it before maybe a month ago. And then I saw a lot of people talking about it recently.
Yeah, I think I have not read Yellowface. I've read the Poppy Wars series, and I've read this one. And I think this came out right before Yellowface.
I see. Okay.
And it's about sort of a magical realism version of Oxford University. And the magic is created by translation, by finding words that share common roots and using that common roots to create a kind of magic. And so these people who have the ability to speak in multiple languages have a lot of power in this world. But of course, the power is being used by the English government to, enrich themselves. And it's an exciting book. It's got a little bit of a thriller aspect to it. But just beautifully written, and it feels like meticulously well researched as well. So, I love this book too.
Well, I guess I got another one for the
Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, so did I, Mike. Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are purchase links in the show notes for you to buy your own copy of Whereas. There are also links to buy Amorak's latest book, Dad Jokes from Late in the Patriarchy. Do check that out as well. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider supporting the show by making a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for that. And you can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechannelopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back with a new episode soon, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.